So we're back with lesson 11, part 2. So we've added a form to our HTML. We've added a little form here. We've used 3 ng model directives as well as a click handler. We wrote an add project method in our component, which then passes the new project and also calls add project in our Angular service. And our service posts the new project to our server controller, which calls project create. And if the project's created successfully, it returns a 201 resource created status all the way back. And then in our component, once we add a new project, once we get a response, we are then refreshing our list by calling the get projects method we wrote last week. It uses the API to query and get our list of projects, and then we're clearing out the form. We're taking advantage of the two-way data binding to set our 3 properties to null. So we're now going to add delete functionality, and then we'll do update last. So we'll kind of go through it again from front end all the way to back end. We'll change the component.html. We'll write a delete method in our component, a delete method in our service, and a delete handler in our controller last. So in my form, inside our table, we're going to add a new column here. We don't actually need any href because we're going to use an Angular click handler. So this is going to be the 4th column. So it's going to look like this. So add one more, I'll put it in the chat, but pretty simple. Just a standard link that says delete. We don't need an href attribute. We're going to use Angular to add a click handler here. So on click, we're going to call delete project and pass in the ID so we know which document we want to delete from MongoDB. Now there's 2 things missing here. WebStorm's complaining for 2 reasons. Number 1, we don't have a delete project method in the component. Number 2, our component doesn't have an ID attribute, an ID property. So we're going to need to fix both these things. So the first thing I'm going to do is generate a delete project method. So if you're in WebStorm, you can use this little code prompt that pops up if you mouse over the delete project in red. And I'll click create method delete project. And then it creates this method for me, which is rather useful. But we're also going to specify here, we should include an ID property now in our project. We didn't really need this before, but if we're going to delete or edit, we need to uniquely be able to identify a document. So let's also include the ID parameter as part of our project. So our delete method going to be similar to the other ones. Again, we're going to return this dot, project service. We're going to call a delete project method. We're going to pass in the ID. And again, we'll subscribe to the response. What should we do after we delete a project? What should happen once a project gets deleted? What should we do in the user interface, in the front end? What did we do in the front end after we finished adding a new project? So if I click delete here, we want to remove it from the database. And what else do we want to do once this project gets removed? Right. Thanks, Maria. Right. We want to refresh the list. So again, we'll call this dot get projects. So there's our delete method. The other thing is we actually, sorry, I don't need the return. We can also add our confirmation here. Because this is all JavaScript on the front end, we could actually put in an if statement right here. Say if confirm, are you sure? So this way we get a little JavaScript confirmation when the user clicks the delete button. In case they hit the wrong button by mistake, they can cancel it. So we'll wrap this in our original tracker. We wrote that as a separate JavaScript file, but because we can write regular JavaScript inside of our TypeScript files. It's supported. So we've put the delete button with our click handler in the HTML. It calls delete project and passes in an ID. So we've done 2 steps of 4. Now we go to the project service. And again, I will just use WebStorm to generate my delete project method. So I'll click it. In the service, it's going to be pretty similar. This time, we're going to use the delete method. And in this case, we need to append on So we're making a delete request. Notice the URL is the same each time. It's always just going to /projects, but the method is different. And here we are appending on as a parameter the ID. So here's the method in our service. So our Angular service is pretty simple. Just takes data from the component, calls a method in our controller. So now that I've got this method in the service, the error in my component goes away. So we've now handled 3 of the 4 layers. So to complete the deletion, we now have to write a delete method in our server controller at the root with an ID parameter at the end. So I'm going to go to the controllers, server controllers projects.js. So this will be at projects. So far in our controllers, we've only used get and post. But on the end of the URL, I'm putting on a colon to represent the parameter, and then our underscore ID. We're going to use Mongoose and call project.remove. And our ID is going to come from request.params._ID. And we may get an error. If we have an error, again, we'll return a JSON response. We'll send a 204 response. I'll just have to remember, I think that's HTTP status codes. 204 is no content. So we're not sending anything back. And 501, if we get an error, no, I'm not sure why I used 501 there. It's probably not the right status I want. Maybe we'll send it in as 400, a bad request. Probably is better. So now we should be able to try out our delete. When we click one of those red delete buttons, we should get a JavaScript pop-up window that says, "Are you sure?" with an OK and a cancel button. If we click cancel, nothing should happen. If we click OK, our component will invoke the service. The service will call delete on the controller. The controller will use our Mongoose model to delete and send back a success response. Give it a try. So I get a confirm box. If I hit cancel, I stay here on the page. If I click OK, then my data refreshes. Notice my page never reloads. Right? There'll be no flashing in the browser tab here up at the top. Data just disappears. So we're 3/4 of the way there. We can add, we can read, and we can delete. Are there any questions, or do you need to see anybody want to see any of this code before we move on to editing? Editing's a little more complex, going to be a little more complex. Okay, thanks, Maggie, because there's two parts to it, right? We have to first select the project somehow, populate the form with that project, and then when we save it, then we're going to have to push the update. So there's going to be two parts. There's kind of an edit, a select, and then a change. So we could add edit buttons, or we can just, again, make our project names links. And when you click on one of these, it just populates that project into the form. So I think we'll do it that way. So again, we'll go through all four layers. First, the HTML changes. Second, the component changes. Third, the service. And fourth, the server controller. So in here, in our first column, we're going to turn these into links. Well, actually, I guess I don't really need to give it a class. We'll just make it an A. And then on the click event, we're going to select the current project. We could just pass in the entire So when you click a project name, we're going to call select project and pass this particular project in. Again, we don't have a select project method yet, so we'll generate this. I'll use WebStorm to generate my select project method. And we'll say this dot So we're going to populate So we want to populate form with selected project. And instead of any, okay, we'll try it like that. We may have to modify this a bit. There's our method. So when we click a project name, it should load that project into the form on the right. We'll see if it works. It does, although these don't look like links. And our due date also isn't populated. So it's sort of working. Let's see. I would think there would be something that would give us some class that would give us the little cursor icon. We may have to come back to that part. Off the top of my head, I don't know. Okay, I'll leave this for now. So our due date isn't showing up. Now we dealt with this before. Let's look at our other project for a minute, our original project tracker. Because we had the same challenge. See what we did here when we were editing. Oh, we did it as short date. We'll see if there's an angular. Maybe we've got model options. Okay, we'll have to come back to that formatting for just a minute. Maybe just for right now, I'm going to take out the type equals date. Not ideal, but I'll deal with the formatting after. I'll maybe figure that out and clean it up on my own time. So we can pick a project and it'll populate. The problem is if I click save now, this button is designed to call add a project. So if I click save, say I change the date here from the 3rd to the 13th. If I go to save, this button is calling add project. So now I get 2 of them. So we're going to have a little trick here, a little spoof. When we're editing, I want to hide this button, but add another button in its place that looks identical that we'll call update instead. And we can use some Angular logic to toggle which button shows up. I'm going to copy this button. Our second button we'll call update, which we'll have to write. And then we only want to show the add button we can use an ngIf to say if there is no ID. So if ID is null, show this button. Otherwise, show this one. So we'll do the opposite here, ngIf so if we have an ID, show update. If we have no ID, show the add button. And then we should also add our ID into a hidden field. And again, our model is going to be, so we're going to add those fields at the bottom of the form. Our add button we already had, but now we're hiding it. So it's going to look to the user like the same save button, but we actually have two buttons and we're toggling which one is visible. When we have no ID, the first button is visible. When we have an ID, the second button is visible instead. And now we're going to need to create, so that should be it for our front end. We've made the names links. We've added the ID as a hidden field. We've added a second save button and we're toggling which one shows up. So our next step is to create the update project method, which is going to be very similar to the add project method. So I'll use my code editor to create the method. So we're going to populate our project. And then we're going to call our service. And again, we'll subscribe to the response. And we'll update the page, update our list, and clear the form, just like we did before. We'll call get and clear. So there's the method in our component. Components create complaining because our service doesn't have an update method yet. So we're going to do that next. That'll clean up the error in our component. So I'm going to use my code hinting here as well to generate the update method. I'm going to click Create Method Update Project. I can take out this definition. This time we're going to use the put method. That's the common HTTP verb in a REST API. That's the method we use when we're doing an update. And it'll be the same URL. But again, we're going to pass the ID on the end of it. Whoops. And also pass in. So we're using the ID as part of our URL. And then we pass in the JSON object that has all the new values for the project. So that's 3 steps of 4 done. Our final step is to go to our server controller and write a put method that will update the document with this ID with all of the values in our JSON object. So that'll be our last step My code editor says there's still an error in my component, but if I click back here, that error should disappear. It says, okay, now we see the update project method in the service. My red line goes away. So now we're going to go back to our server controller and add our final method here in server controllers projects. We're going to use find one and update to update this project. So if we have a put request / projects with an ID. So we're going to call find one and update. Our ID is our request.params._ID. Exactly the same as in our delete. We can actually just try to pass in the request.body here. I'm not sure if that'll work, but we'll try. And then our callback will get either an error or a project. We'll check for an error. If we get an error, we'll say it's a bad request. Otherwise, we'll return a JSON object. I'm going to check the code we want to use here. When a resource is modified, maybe we'll just use 202 for accepted. 201 is a new resource is created. This maybe could be changes to the resource are accepted. We'll see if this one works. We may have to modify this method a little bit. I'm hoping we don't have to map all the individual properties. We can just pass the request body, but that may or may not work. In our original controller, when we called find and update for editing, we actually mapped each field in the request body. But we're going to see if it's smart enough to map the field if we don't map each one. We'll try it. Okay, so that does seem to work. It updates. Maybe I want to change the course. So it updates and my form is cleared. My dates are also showing a bit wonky. I'm not sure why. I just realized. So this is February 25th. But here it says March 14th, and when I go to edit it, it says March 15th. So I will figure that out. I also have to figure out how to render our date, how to format it properly. I'll have to play around. That's probably in our component, I think. I can probably format it some way, but I'll have to figure that out. Which I'll do. Okay, so there's our not quite perfect. I will clean some of these items up on my own time and maybe record another quick video with cleaning up of the dates and our format, but now we have our full CRUD working. I could probably also just add a little reset button here, which would clear my form. So I'll just add that as my last item, and then I'll push all this to Git. So I'll add one more button. So when we click it, it should reset the form. And I need to make one small addition to our clear form method, and that's to also clear out the ID. So I'll clean that up, add that to my clear form, and then I think we're finished. So I'll go back to my component. In my clear form, we also want to null out the ID. So I've added line 46 here. So if I'm browsing around, I can click reset, my form clears out. So it is a lot of code to add all these extra layers with Angular that we didn't have when we were just using handlebars for our front end, right? By adding this whole app with the component and service layer, we have to write a lot more code, but we give our user a faster application, reduces bandwidth because the page isn't being reloaded, and they can do everything in real time on one page. So if we're building a relatively simple app where performance and user experience are paramount, using this full stack with an Angular front end is a good option. Okay, so now we can do full create, read, update, and delete on a single page with our full mean stack app with no page reloads, which was the goal. Are there any questions from anyone? I will upload all this to GitHub, but I guess I'll upload it now, but then I will also clean up our issues with the date. I may need just a little time to do that. If you do not have questions, so the code as it stands right now is up on GitHub. If there are no questions, I will wish you all a happy weekend. Enjoy the sunshine. And I'm looking forward to seeing the tutorials next week. I will ask everyone to please try to be on time next week so that we can get started right at noon with our first tutorial. Okay, and I will have your assignment to part 2. I'll have everyone's marked by next week's class. Yes, for next week, then submit your sample slide deck, member worksheet, and sample project by the start of class next week. Yes, please. Yes, Aditya, that's it for today. Correct, Maggie. Yes, your sample project for your tutorial.